My son gave our wedding dance to his mother-in-law. The mafia boss asked me to dance instead. The moment my son took the microphone at his own wedding and said the mother-son dance belonged to Helen Corsi, I felt 21 years of my life dissolve into a single line of applause. I was sitting 3 tables from the dance floor in a dress I'd altered myself the night before, a small clutch on my lap, a smile already rehearsed for the photograph I now understood no one would take. My son Noah looked past me, into that ballroom of chandeliers and champagne, and told 200 strangers that the woman who had made his new life possible was his mother-in-law. Then a man I had spent an entire year serving cake to across a bakery counter, a man the whole city of Chicago whispered about, stood up in a dark suit and walked directly toward my table. His name was Gino Balenti. He was 53 years old, quiet as a locked room, and he had never once in 12 months treated me as anything other than a baker whose work he respected. He stopped in front of my chair, offered his hand and said, "Dance with me, Beth." I heard the orchestra falter. I heard Helen Corsi's champagne flute clink hard against the rim of her plate. I heard 3 elderly gentlemen along the far wall push back their chairs in perfect unison, as if a bell only they could hear had rung. Before I could think, I placed my fingers in his palm and stood up, because remaining seated one more second would have finished me in front of my only child. If you've ever loved a child so completely that their smallest slight can gut you, stay with me now. I have to tell you what that dance actually meant, and why my son didn't truly understand any of it until weeks later, when the wrong family tried to buy the rest of his life away from him. My name is Beth Lawson. I'm 39 years old, and I own a small custom cake bakery on a leafy street in Oak Park, Illinois. I've been Noah's mother since I was 18, and Aaron's widow since I was 28. For most of those 11 years since Aaron's funeral, my life had been an ordinary rhythm of 5 a.m. ovens, buttercream under my fingernails, and a boy who used to bring his homework to the counter after school. I never expected to be swept into anything larger than a birthday cake order. I certainly never expected to be walked across a wedding floor by a man whose name made grown men rise from their chairs the moment I took his hand. But that's exactly where I found myself the night my son gave my dance away. And the story of how I got there and what I chose to do about it is the story I owe you now, told from the beginning, one honest step at a time. Gino had first come into my bakery on a wet March morning, almost a year before the wedding. He wanted a 2-tier lemon cake for an aunt's 90th birthday. He waited his turn behind a mother with twins and a college boy buying a single cupcake. He paid exact change. He said, "Thank you, ma'am," like a man who'd been raised by a very serious woman. I didn't know his last name until I heard a customer whisper it 2 visits later, and then my hands went cold on the piping bag, because everyone in the greater Chicago area had heard the name Balenti. Still, he only ever ordered cakes, only ever paid in full, and only ever remembered the small details I dropped in casual conversation, the way an old friend might remember them, without ever making a point of it. Once he mentioned in passing that my late husband Aaron had held a good reputation among the neighborhood trucking crews. I didn't ask him how a man like him would know a thing like that. I told myself it was a small city. Helen Corsi arrived in my life the way status usually does, in soft cashmere and softer sentences. She was 50, silver at the temples, a widow herself. She was the mother of my son's fiancée, Chloe. From the first tasting, she treated me kindly, but every kindness carried a small comparison inside it. She would call my little bakery so charming, and then in the same breath, describe the Michelin-adjacent patisserie downtown she'd used for a charity gala the winter before. She would praise Noah's practicality, and moments later, promised to introduce him to a family friend in real logistics. I watched my son, 21 and half in love with a life that fit him like a borrowed coat, begin to lean toward her promises. He never said an unkind word about me. He simply looked tired whenever I described the bakery, as if my work had grown smaller the closer he stood to Helen's world. The wedding preparations moved on Helen's calendar, on Helen's budget, and inside Helen's taste. She paid for the downtown ballroom, the 10-piece orchestra, the imported flowers, the 200 guests. When she gently offered to replace my wedding cake with something from her preferred downtown pastry company, I refused with all the courtesy I had left in me. I told her I would deliver a 5-tier cake by hand, with vanilla bean and Aaron's mother's lemon curd between the layers, and I would not accept a single dollar for it. She smiled the way people smile at something quaint. My son Noah, standing right beside her when she smiled that way, did not defend the meaning of that cake. He only asked me very softly if I could make the finish look more expensive. That night I sat in my kitchen with a whisk in my hand, and I cried once. Exactly once. Then I washed my face and went back to work until the sun came up. The reception hall that Saturday in October was the most beautiful room I had ever stood in, and the loneliest place I had ever been. 200 guests, mostly Corsi cousins and Helen's charity board, filled the tables in cream and gold. My side filled exactly 6 chairs. I sat between an elderly aunt of Aaron's and the empty seat where my own mother would have been if she'd lived. Noah looked handsome enough to break your heart, and Chloe, in her mother's redesigned wedding gown, glowed like a lantern. During dinner, Helen stood and toasted the couple. She thanked the caterers, the florist, the venue, her late husband. She thanked her daughter, then her son-in-law, then, almost as an afterthought at the end, Noah's mother, who has been such a lovely help. That was the exact word she chose. Help. 21 years of motherhood reduced to a helper. Across the room, I saw Gino at a small table near the tall windows with 3 older men I didn't recognize. He was watching me, not the toast. When Helen sat down, he lifted his water glass a 1/4 inch in my direction, the smallest possible acknowledgement, and I felt something loosen in my chest for exactly 1 heartbeat, before Noah stood up, and it tightened again forever. My son took the microphone from the bandleader, a courtly gentleman named Walter Duca, who had played weddings in the old neighborhoods for 40 years and knew every song by heart. Noah said into the microphone that he wanted to do something a little different. He said tradition was beautiful, but tradition sometimes missed the person who truly deserved recognition. He said he wanted to give the mother-son dance to Helen Corsi, because she had made all of this possible. The applause was polite at first, then delighted, then thunderous. Helen pressed a hand to her mouth as if surprised. My son crossed the floor and offered her his arm. Chloe looked at her lap. I did not stand up and shame him. I did not walk out. I sat there in my navy dress, hands folded, and I smiled because he was still my son, and I was still his mother, and humiliating him in front of the woman he had just married would have wounded him more than remaining seated wounded me. Walter began a slow standard, the kind mothers danced to at every wedding in the city, and Helen guided my son around the polished floor with the practiced grace of a woman who'd rehearsed the picture for weeks. I watched them the way you watch a house you used to live in, as somebody else moves the furniture through the front door. When the song ended and the applause rose again, Gino Balenti set down his glass and crossed the room. He didn't look at Helen. He didn't look at Noah. He walked past the head table without a nod, and stopped directly in front of my chair. Up close, he smelled faintly of cedar and clean cotton. He offered his hand, palm up, no ring, no watch flashing, and said simply, "Dance with me, Beth." I heard someone at the next table inhale sharply. I heard Helen, still on the floor, turn on her heel toward us. I heard 3 elderly men along the far wall stand at the same second. I heard the small clink as Marco Corsi, Helen's older brother, set down the flute he'd been about to raise. Walter folded his sheet music closed and began, from memory, a slow, formal waltz I'd never heard in my life. I put my hand in Gino's and he walked me onto the floor. He held me exactly the distance a stranger holds a partner at a formal wedding. His hand at my back was steady. His eyes were not on me, they were on the room. He turned me twice slowly, past the older men who remained standing, past Marco, whose face had gone hard, past Helen, whose smile had cracked at one corner like a plate dropped on tile. Somewhere in the second turn I whispered, "What is happening?" He answered without looking down at me. Something that needed stopping. 3 words. That was all he gave me. When the strange old song ended, he thanked me formally, walked me back to my chair, and returned to his own table without another word. Guests applauded politely, uncertainly. Noah caught my eye from across the floor with an expression I couldn't read. Helen laughed too loudly at something Marco said, but her hand shook. I sat down in that beautiful room and understood, with a cold, clean certainty, that whatever had just happened had not been about me at all. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table in Oak Park with the porch light on and a cup of cold coffee in front of me, replaying my son's voice on that microphone until the words no longer sounded like language at all. At 6 in the morning I opened the bakery anyway, because ovens don't care about broken hearts. I had a christening cake due by noon. At 9 the little brass bell above my door rang, and Walter Duca stepped inside, hat in hand, in the same dark suit he'd worn the night before. He apologized first for the intrusion, then for changing the music I'd originally requested. He said he hoped I could understand, and that he hadn't heard the neutral family waltz played for the loss of name since Aaron himself was still alive. I set the piping bag down on the counter. I asked him what a neutral family waltz was. Walter looked at me the way an old man looks at a woman he's just realized has been kept in the dark her whole marriage. He said it wasn't his place, that Mr. Ballanti should explain it. But if I ever wanted to understand why 3 men had stood the moment I accepted that dance, I should ask about the old freight corridor, and about what my husband had quietly guaranteed for the last years of his life. Then he thanked me for the coffee I hadn't offered him, tipped his hat and left. I locked the front door, turned the sign to closed, and drove out to a quiet address in Elmwood Park that Gino had given me months earlier, in case a delivery van of mine ever broke down. I was going to make him tell me every single word. He met me at his front gate in a gray sweater, no tie, no bodyguards visible, though I knew somewhere in that quiet street men were watching. He didn't act surprised to see me. He led me into a small study lined with books that looked as though they had actually been read. He poured coffee, real coffee, not the ceremonial kind, and sat down across from me. He told me what my husband had done for 11 years before he died. Aaron, he said, had never been mafia. He'd been a legitimate, union-side trucking contractor with a spotless record and a reputation that both criminal families in the city trusted. Decades before Aaron was even born, a freight corridor running through the near western suburbs had been declared neutral ground by an old agreement between the Ballanti and Corsi families, so independent drivers couldn't be treated as anyone's property. The arrangement needed a civilian guarantor to survive, a man of no allegiance whom both criminal families would accept as a fair and honest witness. Aaron had accepted that role 6 years before he died. He had never carried a weapon or laundered a single dollar. He had simply been the quiet human seal on a piece of paper older than both of us, and he deliberately kept the entire matter away from our house because he didn't want it touching me or Noah. When he died in that highway accident, the guarantor role went dormant. The corridor remained neutral by pure inertia, but the old signals, the songs, the standing men, the small ceremonial gestures at family weddings, went to sleep along with him. Until, Gino said quietly, last night. Until my son publicly offered the mother-son dance to Helen Corsi in front of the same older witnesses who still remembered every one of those old customs, from 40 years ago. I asked what that meant exactly, and Gino didn't soften his answer. He said that in the old neighborhoods, when the direct heir of a neutral guarantor gave his first family wedding dance to the senior woman of a patron household, and publicly credited her with making his life possible, older participants could interpret it as a voluntary transfer of the guarantor household under that family's protection. He said Noah hadn't known any of this. He said he was completely certain of that. But Helen had known. Her entire year of expensive introductions and quiet comparisons hadn't simply been ordinary snobbery. It had been careful preparation, so that when Noah eventually gave that dance away, it would look spontaneous and authentic to men whose memories reached back 40 years. Marco Corsi had been ready to accept the gesture the instant the music ended, and in doing so, Marco would have gained a plausible claim over the entire neutral corridor Aaron had once quietly protected with his own good name. I sat in that quiet study with my coffee going cold in my hands, and I felt anger arrive the way a fever arrives, all at once without permission. Gino watched me and didn't fill the silence with reassurance. At last I said, "So when you asked me to dance?" He nodded once slowly. He said his request had been sincere on a personal level, yes, but it had also been a countersignal in the same old language Helen was using. Beth Lawson, Aaron's widow, accepting the arm of Gino Ballanti, had made it impossible for Marco to argue that the Lawson household had unanimously transferred into Corsi patronage. It had preserved my husband's neutrality by aligning me elsewhere, in front of the witnesses. He'd done it in the 15 seconds between Noah handing back the microphone and Helen reaching the floor. He'd done it, he said, because he couldn't watch Aaron's widow lose in that room. I set my cup down. You used me. He didn't deny it. He said he'd had seconds, not minutes, and that he believed protecting me justified acting before explaining. I told him, in the steadiest voice I had, that urgency explained his decision but didn't give him ownership of mine. I told him what Helen had done to Noah, deciding for a young man who didn't understand his own gesture, was exactly what he had just done to me. Different families, different intentions, the same disrespect at the bottom of both of them. He listened to me without flinching. When I finished, he said only, "You are right." He said from that morning forward he would give me information and let me decide what should happen next. Nothing else. No pretty speech, no hand reaching across the desk. And that, more than anything else so far, was what made me realize I didn't entirely hate the man. I went home and called my son. Noah came over that same afternoon, still in the light shirt he had traveled home from the wedding suite in, and he sat at my kitchen table where he used to color when he was a little boy. I didn't raise my voice. I told him what I'd learned, about the neutral corridor, about his father's real role in it, and about the ceremonial meaning of the dance he had given away. He went pale, then red, then very still, in that order. His first words were, "Mom, I didn't know." His second words were, "Helen tricked me." I looked at my only child across the table where I'd once cut his sandwiches into triangles when he was 7, and I told him he was going to have to be a great deal more honest than that if he wanted to sit in my kitchen for the rest of his adult life. I said the political meaning of the dance wasn't his fault. He hadn't been taught the old rules, and no one, not Helen, not Gino, had a right to move him around a ballroom like a chess piece for their own reasons. But the emotional meaning was different. Nobody had put a gun to his head and forced him to leave his mother sitting in a folding chair while he crossed the floor to a woman he'd known for 1 year. Nobody had made him call Helen the person who made his life possible. That sentence had been his own choice, and Helen had only been able to exploit it because part of him had wanted, for months, to be the kind of young man whose life had been built by wealth instead of by a small bakery on a leafy street. He started to argue, then he didn't. He put his forehead down on the table where he'd done his 4th grade math homework. He wept the way boys weep when they're afraid they finally used up their mother's love. Chloe arrived at my door 2 days later, alone, without makeup, her wedding ring still bright on her finger. She sat on my porch swing and told me she'd noticed her mother diminishing me for months, and had said absolutely nothing about it, because she'd been raised to keep the peace at any cost. She said watching Noah give away that dance had made her physically sick, in the middle of her own wedding reception. She said she loved my son, but didn't want to spend the next 50 years of her life married to a man whose spine belonged to her mother. That afternoon we baked a small chocolate cake together on my kitchen counter. By the time it came out of the oven, she'd stopped calling me Mrs. Lawson and started calling me Beth. It was the first small thing in a week that felt at all like healing to me. Marco Corsi, though, was not finished. 10 days after the wedding, an ivory envelope arrived at the bakery, hand-delivered by a driver in a black coat. Inside was an invitation to a private post-wedding blessing at the Oakbrook Country Club, a formal Corsi family gathering to welcome Noah into what the card politely called the extended household. Gino called me the moment his own sources heard about the event being scheduled. He told me the same older witnesses would all be present again. He told me the blessing was designed to remove all ambiguity by having Noah, this time fully informed, publicly accept Corsi patronage in front of every one of them. He said he could stop the entire evening with 2 phone calls, and that no one in the room would dare cross him if he did. All I had to do was say yes. I told him no. I told him if my son's first choice had been manipulated, then the second one had to be genuinely his own. Gino was quiet on the line for a long moment. Then he said, "Understood." He didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply accepted my sentence as if I had been the one with the authority all along. The day before the blessing, I took Noah to meet Frank Moretti. Frank was 71 years old, and he was one of the 3 older men who had stood in the ballroom the exact instant I accepted Gino's dance. He had worked side by side with Aaron on union negotiations for 6 years. We met him at a diner on Roosevelt Road, a place with vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since sunrise. Frank ordered eggs he didn't touch. He told my son what his father had actually been. He said Aaron had accepted the guarantor role because he'd watched independent drivers, one by one, get pulled into obligations they couldn't refuse. He said Aaron's real achievement had not been controlling the corridor. It had been making sure that nobody on any side of the whole arrangement controlled the people who used it. Noah listened with both hands wrapped around his coffee cup, like a boy trying to warm himself in winter. Frank told him about the strike winter, the year Noah was 7, when Aaron had gone 3 straight nights without sleep to keep the local drivers off a Corsi-linked distribution contract that would have quietly absorbed them all. He told Noah that Aaron's name still opened certain doors on the west side of the city, not because Aaron had ever asked for a favor, but because he had refused so many when they were offered. When Frank finished, my son wiped his face on the sleeve of his coat and said very quietly, "I gave the dance to the wrong woman for the wrong reason." Frank simply nodded, the way old men nod when a young one catches up. The Corsi blessing took place on a Thursday evening at a members-only club in Oakbrook, in a private banquet room paneled in dark walnut. Marco stood at the head of a long table in a charcoal suit, flanked by 3 Corsi cousins, and along the far wall, the very same older witnesses who had watched me dance at the reception. Helen wore emerald green and a smile that was 1 degree too bright to be real. Noah and Chloe sat together halfway down the table. I sat directly opposite Helen in a plain black dress, hands folded on the linen tablecloth in front of me. Gino stood at the very back of the room. He had come because I'd asked him to come. He had promised me, in return, not to speak a single word unless Noah himself asked him to. Marco opened by explaining in careful old-world language what the blessing was actually meant to mean for everyone gathered in the room. He told my son that publicly accepting Corsi protection would bring him inside a family capable of guarding his marriage, his career, and eventually his future children. He was polite. He was patient. He was clear. He didn't hide the true meaning of anything this time. Helen spoke next. She said Noah was a young husband now, that the world was harder than he understood, and that no mother wanted to see her daughter married into uncertainty and hardship. She reached her hand across the table toward Chloe as she said it, and I watched my daughter-in-law, for the very first time in her life, gently but firmly move her own hand away from her mother's fingers. Marco then asked my son directly whether he accepted the blessing. The whole room went very still. I felt every older man along the wall lean forward exactly 1 inch. Noah looked at me across the table. I did not look away, but I did not answer for him either. He looked at Gino. Gino kept his eyes on the tablecloth. He looked at Chloe, and my son's wife squeezed his hand once and then let go, so that whatever he said next would be entirely his own words. And then my son stood up. He said he was grateful for the wedding, for Helen's generosity, for the entire year of introductions and doors she'd opened for him at every turn. He said he didn't doubt that she truly loved Chloe. Then he said that his father had spent the last years of his life making sure that ordinary working families never became anyone's property, and that publicly accepting Corsi patronage would undo the one thing Aaron Lawson had left behind on this earth. He rejected the blessing out loud in front of every witness in the room. Helen's face went white as candle wax. Marco set down his glass with great and terrible care. Then my son did the thing that told me more than any apology could that he'd finally understood. He turned to Gino at the back of the room, thanked him for what he'd done at the reception, and then rejected Ballanti patronage too. He said Aaron's name had been respected because Aaron had refused to turn ordinary people into anyone's property, and that meant refusing every family, not only the one at this table. He looked at me last of all. He said, in front of the older witnesses and Helen and the entire Corsi cousinhood, that the woman who had actually made his life possible was sitting across from him in a plain black dress. He said he was sorry for every word he'd said at his wedding, that he didn't expect to be forgiven quickly, and that he would spend the years it took. Then he sat down. Marco turned toward Gino, waiting, because in the old rules, an opening like this belonged by right to whoever had made the counter-signal at the reception. Gino could have walked forward. He could have claimed the neutral corridor by the same old tradition Marco had just tried to use for himself. He would have doubled his influence in the city with a single sentence spoken in front of the correct witnesses, at exactly the correct moment. Instead, Gino lifted his chin toward my son, and said, clearly enough for every man along the wall to hear him plainly. The Lawson household chooses itself. Then he walked to the door and waited there for me without expectation, without a hand held out, so that if I chose to leave with him, it would be my choice alone. I stood up. I kissed my son on the forehead. I hugged Chloe. I walked out of that walnut room with Gino a full step behind me. Not beside me, because he had finally learned the difference between guarding a woman and respecting one. Months passed. Noah declined the entry-level logistics position Helen had arranged through a Corsi-connected firm. He took an ordinary job at an independent freight company on the south side of the city, the honest kind that pays honest wages for honest hours worked by honest people. He and Chloe rented a small apartment 3 blocks from my bakery. He stopped letting Helen manage them, and Chloe gently but firmly drew a line around her mother that Helen still hasn't entirely accepted. Noah began stopping by the bakery in the mornings, not to ask me for anything, only to help me carry heavy trays out of the walk-in cooler. He never once tried to earn back my forgiveness with a long speech. He earned it slowly, morning by morning, simply by being present. I didn't tell him he was forgiven. I let him see it in the way I began saving him the corner piece of coffee cake again, the way I had when he was a boy at that same counter. Gino returned to the bakery too, exactly the same way he always had. He ordered cakes for aunts and longtime employees. He waited his turn. He paid exact change. He never once mentioned the wedding or the blessing, or the counter signal he'd made for me. He never used any of it as leverage over my heart. Slowly, over cups of coffee at the little corner table by the window, he became someone I looked forward to seeing. But he didn't ask me for a second dance. He didn't ask me for dinner. He didn't ask me for anything at all. He had understood that morning in his study, when I told him urgency didn't give him ownership of my choices, that if there was ever going to be anything real between us, I would have to be the one to reach across the table for it first. The bakery turned 10 years old on a Saturday in May. I closed the shop to customers and opened it to friends and family instead. I hung a string of paper lanterns along the window and set out 2 long tables of my own cakes. Noah came early to help me set up. Chloe came with him in a soft yellow dress, carrying a bouquet of daisies she'd picked from a neighbor's yard down the street. Frank Moretti was there in his good coat. Walter Duca was there too, with a small quartet he'd put together just for the afternoon at my request. And Gino Ballanti stood quietly by the door in a gray jacket, exactly the way he always did, waiting patiently to see whether the day belonged to him or not this time. Halfway through the afternoon, when the light through the window had gone golden and the paper lanterns had begun to glow, the quartet started a slow, sweet standard, the kind mothers dance to at every wedding in the whole city, and my son Noah crossed the bakery floor toward me. He stopped in front of me the same way he had not 7 months earlier in that downtown ballroom. He said, "Mom, can I have the dance I should have asked for the first time?" I didn't answer with words. I set down the tray. I put my palm in his, and he walked me out into the small, clear space between the tables. He held me the way a son is supposed to hold his mother at his wedding. Chloe was crying openly. Frank was smiling into his coffee cup. And I let myself feel, for the first time since October, that something broken clean through the middle of me was finally allowed to be whole again. When the song ended, Noah kissed my forehead and stepped back. The quartet paused, waiting for a signal. Across the room, near the door where he'd been standing all afternoon, Gino watched me without moving so much as an inch. He didn't step forward. He didn't raise his hand. He waited the way a man waits when he's finally learned that the next dance is not his to take by right. I looked at him across 10 years of hard work in a bakery I had built with buttercream and stubbornness, in a life no man had ever chosen for me. I understood with the same cold, clean certainty I'd felt on the ballroom floor, that this time the choice belonged only to me. I crossed the bakery floor myself. I stopped in front of him. I held out my hand, palm up, exactly the way he had once held out his for me, and I said, "Dance with me, Gino." He looked down at my hand as if he wanted to remember exactly how it looked in the golden light. Then he put his fingers in mine and let me walk him into the small square between the tables. The quartet began a waltz. It was not the old neutral family waltz. It was not the standard he'd once been forced to answer with in front of frightened witnesses. It was an ordinary song for an ordinary Saturday in May, and we danced to it as an ordinary man and woman who had finally arrived at each other by choice, without signals, without strategy, without a single older man needing to rise from his chair. Somewhere behind us, my son was holding his wife's hand. Somewhere in the city, Helen Corsi was learning that money could buy a wedding, but never a household. And Marco Corsi was learning that some corridors could not be taken by tradition alone. Somewhere in this country, women my age were still being told that our best years had already been spent, that our sacrifices were invisible, that our dances belonged to whoever happened to ask us first. But not in this bakery. Here, in a shop I had built with my own 2 hands, I danced with a man who had learned how to wait for me. And I felt, at 39 years old, that my real life had only just begun to open in front of me. The first time Gino had asked, because he believed I needed protecting from a room full of powerful men. The final time I asked because I wanted him standing in front of me in ordinary light on an ordinary day. If this story moved you, if any part of Beth's journey lives inside your own kitchen, or your own quiet evenings after everyone else has gone to bed, please give this video a like and subscribe, so that stories about mothers who refuse to disappear can keep finding the people who most need to hear them told out loud.